of this sub portion of the loop body has to execute only on one SIMD lane. All right, so another big thing we added is the task loop construct. And that basically says take this loop and break it up into tasks and execute it in parallel, if I'm in a parallel region, as tasks. And the reason you might want to do that is if you have, say, a piece of I/O that you want to do and that you're executing in a task within that same team, previously you really had no way to do that. You would have to do it off in a separate section. You'd have to use nested parallelism in order to get at that. This allows you to say, and then that thread would never end up helping on the iterations of the loop. Here you can say, put that I/O into a task, have that executing, come to the loop, break that up into tasks, and all of the remaining threads can go and execute it. And then if that I/O thread gets done, it can come back and help out as well. Lots of other stuff there. Probably the biggest other thing that we added is that we now have support for reductions on C and C++ arrays. It was actually a fairly straightforward extension to what we added in 4.0 for user-defined reductions. It's also been one of the most frequently requested things when I tell people, let me know what you'd like to see in OpenMP. If you remember, we also added support in 4.0 for Fortran 2003. We had a list of 14 items that were not yet supported, so limitations on our support for Fortran 2003. We've cut that down by 4. I'm hoping maybe by the time we're done with 4.1, we can maybe cut it down to 5. At this point, I don't think it's realistic to think we'll get it completely done for 4.1. So what other things do we think will end up being in 4.1? Well, first of all, we are going to refine the device constructs further. So what happens when you move an array section over that's indicated by a pointer? What happens to the pointer itself? We'll resolve that somewhat. We're going to add additional combined constructs. And in 4.0, we tried to really go through and say if a clause could apply to both constructs, these are the semantics you would get. All right. Previously, we said if the semantics of applying it to one was different from applying it to the other, then you got unspecified behavior. We did a pretty good job of that. The one thing we know we didn't handle as well as we should have was the if clause, and we'll clean that up. We'll be adding a memcopy API, which will allow you to basically manually say, move this over. It allows you to move over parts of variables and things like that, so parts of structures, and basically have more complete support for being able to move things to the device and back. We're going to be adding support for low-level device code, so basically if you move something over the device, you will now be able to use it in, say, a piece of CUDA code. So if you're using the CUDA BLAS library, this would give you a mechanism by which you could use the data that you've moved over there with OpenMP. Then some other various tweaks, and probably the biggest thing remaining on this list then is deep copy. And that's my expectation. So that's a way to basically say if we have a linked list or more complex C++ classes and things, how can you ensure that you really move over the full data specified by that class? I expect that will actually probably be the thing that takes us the longest to get done for 4.1, and so that will probably be the final thing that we add in 4.1. We will be adding some other things. We got a couple things that we're looking at for SIMD, basically allowing you to more directly control the size of the vector length that gets used in the SIMD constructs. Another thing we're likely to do is add a grammar for OMP places, which is how we specify the thread affinity. That won't really change how things work, but it make it a little clearer how things work. And as I mentioned, we'll continue working on the Fortran 2003 support. And then some of these other things, well, task priorities I strongly expect to get done. In fact, that may well get voted in before the end of this year. But the initial support for memory affinity and interoperability with P-threads and the reduction stuff are things that we have hopes to add for 4.1, but they may not get done before.
What do you mean whenever you say interoperability with P-threads? Is this...
All right, so what happens if I start a program and the first thing I do is I create a P-thread, and then in the initial thread, I create an OpenMP region, and in the P thread, I create an OpenMP region. How do those two different OpenMP regions relate to each other? And how can they interact? So it turns out that if you read the specification clearly, it actually already says something about it. There are those who don't like what it says. All right, so for 5.0, we're considering some more significant things. One of the big things that I think we've heard people would like, and which will be a massive effort, is adding support for C11 and C++11. We're looking at additional advances for tasking. So right now, if you want to use tasks, the most common pattern for using them, so OpenMP tasks, if they're not in a parallel region, specify that the work in the tasks is concurrent but not executed in parallel. All right, so the most frequent pattern for using tasking, because you want it to be in parallel, is you write, you start an OpenMP parallel region, and then you start a single region, and you generate all your tasks within that single region, and then other threads in the team pick up the tasks and execute them. That might strike one as somewhat cumbersome and certainly counterintuitive, but that's the way it works. There are those of us who maintain there's no reason that it has to work that way, and that it would be fairly straightforward for us to eliminate that kind of clunkiness. We're also looking at adding support for event loops. So the most frequent place you encounter this is with GUIs. It also apparently comes up fairly frequently with things like DSPs. So we'll continue to improve the device support. As I mentioned, the performance tool support I expect to go into 5.0. It won't go into 4.1 because it's really, it would imply a very significant burden on the implementers, although many of them are already adopting it. And we're also looking at adding an interface for supporting debugging tools as well as performance tools. And really getting at more issues with interoperability and composability. Really giving much better ways of specifying memory locality and memory affinity. All right, and so that also would answer one of the biggest criticisms that people make of OpenMP, which has some legitimacy actually. And then there's a bunch of other things that we may or may not do, but there are those who are advocating for them. So I think Michael already covered this, so I won't go into it too much other than if you're interested in OpenMP and you would like to participate, it's fairly easy. Michael's slide said something about one member of the language committee per OpenMP member. I'm not sure where he came up with that because it's not actually true. There are actually as many we have many organizations who have multiple people participate in the language committee. Now, when it comes time to vote on tickets, each member gets one vote. So that's maybe what he was thinking And also, in general, we let people who aren't affiliated with an OpenMP member participate as Comp Unity members. And the way you can become a Comp Unity member is to attend IWOMP. Alternatively, you can talk to me and then I'll say you're a Comp Unity member.
I have to talk to you?
Yeah, well, you know, it's the price you have to pay, you know. And as Michael mentioned, there may be some changes to OpenMP membership types, and that may have some implications for how you participate. But in the end, we are very much an open organization, so it's not going to change that, I can assure you. And with that, I'm basically finished. If there's any questions, I can give time for one or two brief questions. Otherwise, you can speak to me after we finish with the implementers getting their chance to tell us what they've been up to. Anyone?
Just one point. The TR3 PDF and the differences between 4.0 and 4.0 plus TR3 PDF are now on the website listed under specifications.
All right.
They're now there.
Very good. That's Richard Friedman, who's our editor. So he makes sure that everything gets into the specification correctly. He's also, I guess, our video editor, our videographer or something for at least this evening. Anyone else have questions or comments?
Okay, I'd like to ask that you hold the questions and then we'll get to the